Okay, I'm going to be finishing the presentation that I started yesterday, talking about how new species get created. We were working on some definitions yesterday in class, and I have two more definitions that you need to add to your notes sheet. So at this point, if you don't have your notes out already, go ahead and pause the video, get your notes out. You need to write these down. You're going to be doing some practice examples that will model what you'll have to do next week on the assessment on this topic. So we have two new definitions. Well, one is actually not a new definition, but two definitions that you need to keep in mind as we go forward in explaining how a species gets created. The first one is a new word. It's gene pool. So this word right here that we see, gene pool. A gene pool, the reason that what a gene pool is basically all of the genes that are found in a certain population of animals. Remember, genes are actually pieces of DNA that create traits. So they're all the variations of a certain trait that are present in a population. And sometimes a gene pool is extremely diverse. If you look around the classroom, this gene pool in terms of hair color or skin color is very diverse in humans. Sometimes the gene pool is not particularly diverse, and every individual has the same markings. So in other animals, coloration is often doesn't have a lot of variation. But for all traits, because variation exists, variation always exists as a result of random mutation, there is a gene pool. Okay, so I have two pictures here. Yesterday you were writing down definitions and then drawing a picture. So here's a picture of a gene pool of frogs. Most of the frogs are green, but there's some purple frogs and some red frogs, and all together, all those frogs together and all the variations represent the gene pool, or these are called peccaries. So let's say these are all the variations present in the population, and the two genes, the two alleles, the copies of the gene that they have, big B or little b. Some individuals are big B, little b, some are little b, some are big B, but all of those capital B's and lowercase b's go into the gene pool, and that describes or that identifies all the different genes that are possible. And then I need you to remember what a population is, and I need you to remember it in a very specific way. Population is not just all individuals. It is a group of one species. So you would never talk about, for instance, the population of fish in Weaver Lake. That is not a population. A population has to be of one species, and they have to live in a specific area. So you can actually, in biological terms, have two different populations of the same kind of animal. So here's an example, an easy example to illustrate that. Since I was talking about fish, here's a map of Osseo is up here, Maple Grove, Brooklyn Park, couple of lakes. Now this is a largemouth bass, common fish in Minnesota. I have caught largemouth bass in this lake, Weaver Lake here, in Rice Lake, and in Fish Lake. Now, Rice Lake and Fish Lake may be connected at certain times by wetlands, but Weaver Lake is certainly not connected to either of these two. So technically, these three lakes, because most of the time they are disconnected, are three different populations of largemouth bass. Now, they're all the same species. The largemouth bass here are the same species as the largemouth bass here as the largemouth bass here. But technically, this is its own population, this is its own population, and this is its own population because they're unable to pass from one lake to the next. If Rice Lake and Fish Lake, because of flooding, were connected for a period of time, then all of the largemouth bass in those two lakes would be free to mix, and they would be considered simply one population instead of two. Okay? So, here's why this is important. Basically, we need to tie all of these concepts that we've talked about over the past 2 days, these two, together. So, species are created in a sort of, or one of the ways species are created, the primary way biologists believe species are created, is a four-step process. The first step is that you have a population of a certain species, and that population has a gene pool, a mixture of genes that they have. Then the population has to get split in two, for a whole variety of reasons. Fish Lake and Rice Lake, in our example before, probably at one time were connected lakes, but they have been split. So they can be split for a variety of reasons. It can be because of changes in geography, changes in climate that make things dry out or become more wet or whatever. An animal gets washed to a new island. There's lots of examples of animals getting washed from one island to another, and all of a sudden they're reproductively isolated because they're on a new island. That's the first reason for reproductive isolation. If you remember from yesterday, there's two ways you can become reproductively isolated. At this point, the two species are still the same species because they still have a similar or the same gene pool. So all the fish in those three lakes are considered the same species because they have the same gene pool. They could breed with each other. I could take a fish from Weaver Lake and put it in Fish Lake, and that bass could breed with any of the bass that were there. But because they're reproductively isolated, they don't actually breed with each other. Now, here's where we get into the species creation. Once the two populations have been split and become reproductively isolated, if natural selection, so the predators or the food or the climate, is different in those two places, then each of those populations is going to change as a result of natural selection. So natural selection will favor certain traits in one of the populations and a different trait in other populations. And the end result is that you end up with two populations that are now have very different gene pools. They started off as coming from the same gene pool, but because certain individuals in the population might get selected in one area, and in another area, different kinds of individuals are selected, you get a change. So if we go back and we think about these frogs, maybe they get separated by a new river that forms as a result of a flood, and you get a population on one side and the other. Maybe on one side of the river, there's also a flower that the frogs like to hide on. Maybe it's a tree frog. And maybe that flower is purple. And so these purple ones will get favored, and over time there will be more purple ones. And maybe on the other side of the river there aren't purple flowers, and the flowers that they're hiding on, or the trees they're hiding on the green leaves. And so the green individuals will be favored. And so over time, one side of the river you'd have more purple ones, the other side of the river you'd have more green ones. Okay, so now their gene pool changes. Now we have two different species. So even if that river disappeared and those frogs were reunited, they will now remain reproductively isolated. That's for the second reason. So maybe you're saying to yourself, yeah, that sounds great, but that's all imaginary, made up stuff. So here's a real example of reproductive isolation that led to two different species. And I'm going to ask you to reflect on this in a second, so please pay attention. We have spotted owls. This is a kind of owl that lives in the western United States. And at one time, probably about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, all spotted owls lived all over in this part of the continent, and there was forest everywhere in here. They were all one gene pool. Well, then there's been a drought over the past, really since the last ice age. So 80, 90,000 years. There's been a big drought that has caused this part in the middle to turn into a desert. There's no forest here, and these birds live in forests. Well, the end result is that we have a population now of northern spotted owls that live in wet, mature pine forests, and we have a population of southern, what is happening? Hold on. What happened? There we go. Of southern spotted owls that live in dry, mature pine forests. So the population had a gene pool. They were all mixed together. The population became reproductively isolated because they won't cross this desert and they can't breed in there because there's no forests. Now the forces of natural selection are different. This is a wet, mature forest, and these forests down here are dry. So there's going to be different food. There's going to be different climate. There's a whole different kinds of predators live here than down here. And changes happen to them as a result. And you can see them. They look different. So now even if you were to bring these two owls back together, or if for some reason this desert starts to become wet again and becomes a forest and they could become united, they probably will not reproduce with each other because they are two separate species and they have very different behaviors. Okay? Now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to write out a description of how the spotted owl went through the process of creating a new species. using the steps that I outlined earlier. I pretty much went through it, so if you need to rewind the video and listen to what I just said again, you can. But I need you to apply each of these 4 statements to what happened to the spotted owl. Tomorrow we're going to do the same thing with humans, and I would like you to turn this in on a little half sheet of paper so that I can see how well you explained each of these steps. I'm looking for sentence, not bullet points. Thanks, guys. See you tomorrow.